Billionaire's son married the adorable Maid. Their triplets united his father's cold heart. She was holding a cup of tea. She hadn't yet drunk when he came around the corner. That detail stayed with her afterward, the warmth of the ceramic against her palms, the way she had been standing there in the half-dark of the corridor, telling herself she just needed water, telling herself she hadn't heard his door. Then he was there. Ethan, 6 years older, a little quieter in the way he moved, but unmistakably the same man who had taken up permanent residence in the part of her chest she couldn't seem to renovate. He stopped when he saw her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. That stretched well past comfortable. "Can I tell you something?" he said. Clara looked at him, really looked, the way she had spent 3 days carefully avoiding, and something in her steadied, the way it always had around him, and she hated that. She hated that her body still recognized him as safe. "You can tell me anything you want," she said. "Whether it changes anything is a different conversation." He nodded slowly, like he had expected exactly that answer. Then he reached up, and she saw it for the first time. Or maybe she had seen it and refused to register it, the thin chain at his collar. His fingers found it without looking. He lifted it over his head and held it out between them. And the ring caught what little light existed in that corridor, and Clara stopped breathing. She knew that ring. She had held that ring once, in a different life, in a version of herself she had buried with considerable effort. "I never took it off," he said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She looked at the ring. She looked at him, and then she did the only thing she could do. She stepped back into her room and closed the door. Softly, not a slam, close, the kind that is somehow worse. Because before you can understand why that ring destroyed her and saved her in the same breath, you need the whole story. You need to know how a maid and a billionaire's son ever found each other in the first place. How a powerful man decided their happiness was an inconvenience he could simply remove, and how 3 6-year-old children walked back through the gates of Whitmore Manor one rainy afternoon and made every buried thing impossible to keep buried. Welcome, everyone. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found this channel. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. And if you're returning, you already know we don't rush these. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Welcome, welcome. You found Mr. Legacy Golden Stories, and whether this is your very first time here or you've been with this family for a while, I am genuinely glad you're in this seat tonight. To everyone just discovering the channel, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never walk into the middle of a story again. Every episode drops here first, and you don't want to be the last to know. To the returning family, you already know how we do things. We take our time. We honor every detail. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and there is something I love deeply about knowing this story is reaching kitchens and living rooms and late-night earbuds across the globe. Today's story is about what happens when pride costs a family everything, and what it takes, over years, through silence and grief and one very stubborn ring, to earn it back. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The iron gate of Whitmore Manor was exactly as Clara remembered it, tall, black, and faintly theatrical, the kind of gate designed to make people feel small before they'd even announce themselves. She had stood on the other side of it many times over the years she worked here, always arriving through the staff entrance around the back, always with her eyes tracking the gravel, careful not to be seen looking at things that didn't belong to her. That was the version of herself she had buried. This time, she stood at the front. She had 3 children beside her, each one occupying the space in a completely different way. Lily had already pressed her face between the iron bars, both hands gripping the metal, studying the manor ahead with the focused intensity of a child conducting a formal inspection. Rose stood with her small hand tucked inside Clara's, not frightened exactly, but deliberate, the kind of child who decided how she felt about a place before she committed to it. And the third, the quietest of the 3, stood slightly apart, his dark eyes moving slowly across the stone facade, the arched windows, the ivy that had crept another foot along the east wall since Clara last looked at it. He was reading the building the way other children read picture books. Clara watched him for a second and felt the familiar ache of recognizing someone in your child, and not being sure whether that was a gift or a warning. She pressed the intercom button. Pause. The kind that reminded you someone was deciding whether to answer. Name, said a voice she didn't recognize. New staff. That was fine. My name is Clara Whitmore, she said. I am expected. That last part was not entirely true. She had sent a letter, formal, measured, addressed to the estate administrator rather than to the family, because she knew which channel was harder to ignore. She had received no reply, but she had also done 6 months of quiet, careful work at a kitchen table after the children were asleep, and she knew what she was entitled to. She had calculated it, listed it, had it reviewed by a solicitor who specialized in contested inheritance and family trusts. She understood the legal architecture of this estate better now than most people who had lived inside it. So when she said expected, what she meant was, you should have been expecting me, because I gave you every opportunity to prepare. The gate opened. Those months of preparation had not looked heroic from the outside. They had looked like a tired woman with a lamp on at midnight. 3 children asleep in the next room. A legal pad covered in her own handwriting, and a very specific kind of fury, the kind that has nowhere useful to go until you convert it into something with bullet points and cited statutes. That was what she had done. With it, she had taken every door that had been closed in her face and mapped them. She had taken the grief and made it architectural, and she had arrived at this gate not as someone appealing to anyone's better nature, but as someone who had done the work. The children walked through the entrance hall ahead of her, and Clara watched them take it in. Lily immediately identified the portrait gallery to the left and began moving toward it with the confidence of someone who had already decided it was hers to examine. Rose stopped in the center of the marble floor and looked up at the ceiling, then down at her shoes, then up again, processing the scale of it, recalibrating. And the quiet one stopped just inside the doorway, turned slowly, and looked back at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. She had come back for them. That was the story she told herself. And it was true. The most important, true thing she had. But have you ever done something for one reason, and discovered halfway through that there was another reason underneath it the whole time? The one you didn't put on any list. The one that didn't have a legal citation. She knew it was there. She had known since she packed the bags. She just wasn't ready to say his name out loud yet. She wasn't sure she could say it without her voice doing something she wasn't prepared to explain to 3 6-year-olds. If you know that feeling, if you've ever arrived somewhere telling yourself one story while carrying another, drop a comment below. You don't have to explain it. Just say, I know, because Clara would understand. The staff member who found Ethan that morning was new enough to be nervous about it. She had knocked on the study door twice before entering, delivered the information in a single careful sentence. A woman named Clara Whitmore has arrived at the front gate, sir, with 3 children, and then gone very still, the way people do when they realize they've said something that has weight they don't fully understand. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He was standing at the window, and he stayed there, looking out at the grounds, and the only thing that shifted was his right hand, which rose without instruction from any conscious part of him and pressed flat against his chest, against the chain beneath his shirt. He didn't seem where he'd done it. That was the thing about habits formed in grief. They stop asking permission. He had known this was a possibility. His father's solicitor had mentioned the letter in passing, in the tone men, like his father's solicitor, used when they were relaying information they expected to be dismissed. Ethan had not dismissed it. He had gone back to his room that evening and sat with it. The fact that she had written, formally, through the correct channels, with a precision that told him everything about who she had become in 6 years. She had not appealed. She had stated there was a difference, and he felt it like pressure behind the sternum. He walked toward the east sitting room, the way a man walks toward something he has imagined so many times it has started to feel fictional. You run a scenario in your mind often enough, and it starts to belong to the category of things that will never actually happen, things that exist only as a recurring ache at 2 a.m. And then they happen, and you have to renegotiate the entire architecture of what's real. He stopped in the doorway. Her back was to him. She was speaking quietly to the children. The 3 of them had distributed themselves across the sitting room with a confidence that startled him, because they moved like people who had decided to be comfortable before anyone gave them permission. The one he'd later learn was Lily had pulled a book from the lower shelf and was holding it upside down, examining the spine. Rose had found the window seat and was sitting in it with her hands folded, watching the garden with the gravity of a much older person. And the third, the quiet one, was standing in front of the fireplace, not touching anything, just looking, the way someone looks at a painting when they think no one is watching them feel something. It was Lily who noticed him first. She turned, still holding the upside-down book, and regarded him with the complete absence of social caution that belongs exclusively to young children and very elderly people who've stopped caring. "Who are you?" The question landed with the full, unfiltered force of someone who didn't know that some questions need softening. Ethan opened his mouth. Clara turned. He had prepared, in some vague way, for this moment. He had not prepared adequately. The thing that moved across her face when she saw him was there, and gone in under a second. He would not have caught it if he hadn't spent years learning exactly how she looked when she felt something she didn't want to feel. He caught it. He held it privately and said nothing. "Ethan," she said, his name in her voice, after 6 years. "Clara," he said, hers in his. 4 syllables total. A conversation that would have taken 6 years to have properly, compressed into the only exchange that was currently survivable. The children reacted as themselves. Lily looked between them with bright, calculating eyes, sensing a story she hadn't been given access to yet. Rose watched Clara's face rather than Ethan's. She was the one who read rooms by reading her mother. And the quiet one turned from the fireplace and looked at Ethan with an expression so still and so searching that Ethan had to remind himself to breathe. "I came to speak with your father," Clara said. "Not, I came back. Not, I've missed this place. Or, I've thought about this moment, or any of the dozen true things she could have said." She chose that sentence with the care of someone who had decided exactly how much territory to give. The precision of it told him she had rehearsed it. The flatness of her voice told him the rehearsal had cost her something. "I know," he said. Then nothing, because everything else that existed between them was true and dangerous and completely without a safe place to land, and they both understood that. And the children were right there, and his father was somewhere in this house, and this, whatever this was, had only just begun. If you're feeling the weight of that doorway moment right now, you're exactly where this story needs you. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances, or someone who isn't sure yet. Sometimes a story does the convincing. Harrison Whitmore had not survived 40 years of building one of the most formidable private fortunes in the country by being unprepared. So when his estate administrator brought him the news that Clara had arrived, not called ahead, not asked permission, but simply arrived, with 3 children and a legal posture, he did what he always did with situations that required careful handling. He prepared a room, not a warmer, not a room that said, "Welcome back." A formal sitting room on the ground floor, the one reserved for solicitors and board members and people whose presence in his house was a matter of business rather than belonging. He had a tray of tea arranged, 2 chairs set at a deliberate angle, and he positioned himself behind the emotional advantage of having chosen the setting. This was how Harrison operated. Terrain was leverage. What he had not prepared for was Lily. The mix. Up was entirely mundane. A new member of staff, an unclear instruction, a 6-year-old who moved faster than anyone anticipated and had already decided that the most interesting door in the corridor was the one that was slightly ajar. By the time anyone registered what had happened, Lily was standing in the center of Harrison Whitmore's private study, in the middle of his most controlled and carefully curated space, looking around with the calm, thorough attention of a building inspector. Harrison looked up from his desk and found her there. She met his eyes without flinching. Most adults didn't manage that. She looked at the mahogany shelves, the ranked files, the framed documents, the heavy curtains, the general architectural language of a room that existed to communicate authority. She completed her assessment. Then she delivered her verdict. "There aren't any toys in here," she said. Harrison Whitmore, who had sat across negotiating tables from men who ran governments, who had restructured 3 companies before most people finished university, who had made his eldest son's future disappear with a single decision delivered in this very room, had no answer for that. Not an immediate one. The observation wasn't a complaint, exactly. It was a finding. She was simply reporting what the evidence showed. He came around from behind the desk, which was itself an event. Margaret, his longtime personal secretary, was standing near the window with her notepad, and she registered it the way you register the sky doing something unexpected. Not with alarm, but with a very careful stillness. In 22 years, she had never seen Harrison Whitmore put himself on the same side of a desk as anyone he hadn't already decided to trust. He pulled the chair out, across from his own position, and sat in it, settled there, they saw it as designed for other people? Lily had moved to the desk and was examining his objects with her hands clasped behind her back, not touching, just inspecting, which showed a restraint that surprised him. She studied the glass paperweight, the letter opener, the photograph he kept face, down that no one ever asked about. She did not ask about it either. But she looked at it longer than she looked at anything else. Clara appeared in the doorway behind him, breathless, colour in her face, and for a half-second she took in the scene with an expression that was 1 part relief and 3 parts an emotion she didn't have a word for yet. She wondered. Clara began. "She's fine," Harrison said. He hadn't planned to say it that way. He hadn't planned to say anything that didn't maintain the proper distance he had spent 6 years engineering between himself and the consequences of his choices. But the words came out flat and certain, and Clara went quiet. And that was the first thing Harrison Whitmore had ever said to her that wasn't a transaction. He looked at her over Lily's head. A look Clara couldn't fully interpret, and wasn't sure she wanted to. Wasn't warm. Warmth was not a language Harrison had ever been fluent in. But it was something she hadn't seen from him before. It was undecided, and for a man whose face had been professionally conclusive her entire time working in his house, undecided was as close to vulnerability as his architecture allowed. "Sit down," he said. "Not Mims Whitmore, not Mrs. The title wouldn't come. He had no title that fit the situation he'd created, and the absence of one said more than any version of her name could have. Clara sat. Lily continued her examination of the desk, moving to the bookends now, testing their weight with gentle hands, and Harrison watched her, the set of her jaw when she concentrated, which was entirely his bloodline and entirely undeniable in its source. The directness of her, which was Clara, and then something else, something around the eyes and the quality of stillness she went to when something interested her, something that reached further back than Ethan, something Harrison kept behind a door he had not opened in a very long time. He looked away before it opened now, but the look had lasted long enough. Margaret had seen it. And Margaret, who wrote everything down, wrote nothing in that moment, just held her pen and watched the most controlled man she had ever worked for sit very quietly with something he couldn't file away. "Before we go any further, I need to know, this the kind of story that keeps you up at night? Because it is about to get considerably deeper. Drop my yes in the comments right now if you are watching every part of this through to the end, and if someone in your life needs a story about love that finds its way back through the most unlikely doors, this is the one to send them tonight. Now, let's talk about the woman in the background who spent 6 years making sure Clara never came back, until something changed that she didn't see coming. Margaret had been at Whitmore Manor for 15 years, and in that time she had learned that the most useful thing a person in her position could be was invisible in the right moments and indispensable in all the others. She had not arrived with ambition in the conventional sense. She hadn't wanted Harrison's name, or his fortune, or his attention in any way that could be called personal. What she had wanted, and what she had carefully, methodically collected over 15 years, was relevance. The particular security that comes from being the person who knows where everything is filed, who remembers what was said in rooms where no one was meant to be taking notes, who has made herself so structurally essential that removing her would require dismantling something load-bearing. She kept files Not all of them official, not all of them in the cabinet that Harrison knew about. Here is the thing about Margaret that the easy version of this story would skip over. She was not cruel. That matters, because cruelty would have made it simpler. A cruel person knows what they are doing and enjoys it, and there is a clarity to that which almost makes it easier to name. Margaret was not cruel. She was a woman who had spent 15 years learning that proximity to power was its own form of survival, and that survival required the power to keep standing. She had watched Harrison manage people the way a man manages a portfolio, efficiently, without sentiment, always toward a return, and she had internalized his logic so completely that when the situation with Clara arose, she did not think of it as a decision requiring moral weight. She thought of it as an outcome that needed to be achieved, and a method that needed to be chosen. Harrison had said, and this was the part she returned to, the part she had organized her conscience around for 6 years, that the relationship could not continue, that the Whitmore name had a particular gravity, a particular set of requirements, and that what had developed between his son and a member of the household staff was a problem that required resolution. He had said this once, with the full force of a man who expected the problem to resolve itself. He had not specified how. He had, in the way of powerful men who prefer not to know the details of unpleasant things, simply communicated the desired outcome and looked away. Margaret had filled in the how. The forged documents had been, technically, elegant. Clara had received papers, formal, legal in their presentation, carrying the appropriate seals, declaring the marriage legally invalid on the grounds of procedural error in the original filing. It was the kind of document that a young woman without an extensive legal background and without the resources to immediately contest would accept as conclusive, particularly a young woman whose husband had gone completely silent. When the man you married stops returning your calls and official documentation arrives explaining that the marriage was never properly recognized, the conclusion writes itself. Clara had not stayed to interrogate it. She had left. That was what Margaret had counted on. That Clara would leave, and that distance would do the rest of the work. Distance and time, and the particular exhaustion of being a young woman alone in a situation with no apparent advocates. Now Margaret stood near the window of the corridor outside Harrison's study and watched Clara sitting across from the man who had built the walls that were supposed to keep her out. She watched the 3 children occupying the room with the effortless confidence of people who belonged in it, and something moved through her chest. A sensation she recognized enough to know she didn't want to examine it too closely. It was the feeling of a calculation, coming back with a different answer than the one you originally got. She looked down at her notepad. She was preparing another document, a formal summary of the estate's position regarding any claims arising from the children's presence, a piece of administrative work that would, if Harrison signed it, close several doors very efficiently. She believed Harrison's hesitation in that room was temporary. She had seen him hesitate before. He always returned to structure. Structure was the language they shared. What Margaret did not know, what she had never known, because she had been so precise and so thorough in her forgery that she had never needed to go looking for the original, was that the real marriage certificate still existed somewhere in Whitmore Manor, filed in a place she hadn't indexed, carried into the house in the early days of a relationship that had moved faster than anyone was prepared for, and never properly removed. The document she had forged had been convincing enough to move Clara out of the country. But it had not erased what was registered. And there is a significant difference between a lie that everyone believes and a truth that no one has looked for yet. The crack in the foundation of everything Margaret had built was already there. She just hadn't felt it shift beneath her yet. But the notepad was open. The next document was half written. And somewhere on the other side of that study door, a 6-year-old named Lily was asking Harrison Whitmore why his desk had a photograph turned face down. And this time, he was considering whether to answer. Of the 3 children, the one the staff noticed least in those first 2 days was the one who was paying the most attention. He wasn't shy. That was the wrong word for it, and anyone who spent more than an hour around him understood that quickly. He simply operated on a different timeline than other people, where Lily processed the world by engaging it immediately, and Rose processed it by watching carefully before committing. This one, the quiet one, the third, observed everything first and held it privately, turning it over, in whatever interior space he had built for exactly that purpose. When he did finally speak, the words tended to land with a weight that made the people around him go briefly still, because he didn't waste them. His name was Theo, and he had been drawing since he was 3 years old. Not the ordinary way that children draw, not the kind that fills a refrigerator door with approximate suns and stick figures. Theo drew the way other people write in diaries, because for him that was what it was. Record, a way of taking the feeling of a room and making it exist on paper where he could look at it from the outside. Clara had long since stopped being surprised by what appeared on his pages. She had learned to take them seriously. On the second evening at Whitmore Manor, after his mother had settled the 3 of them in the guest rooms, and the house had moved into its nighttime register, Theo took his drawing pad and walked. He had spent the day watching. He was very good at watching without appearing to do so. He had the quality of furniture in that way, present and unobtrusive, which meant that people tended to behave naturally around him. He had watched Ethan move through rooms with a careful, practiced stillness, the kind that belongs to someone who has learned to take up less space than he's entitled to. He had watched Harrison Whitmore look at objects in his own house with the slightly unseeing expression of a man who stopped noticing his surroundings sometime in the past and has not bothered to begin again. He had watched his mother's shoulders, high and precise when other adults were in the room, dropping by exactly 1 degree when it was only the 3 of them, and Theo had counted this difference and understood it without having a name for it. And he had watched the dinner table, where 2 men sat at opposite ends of a length of wood that could have comfortably seated 12, with the careful, geographic distance of people who have something important to say to each other and have decided, for reasons the table couldn't explain, not to say it. He sat down on the corridor floor outside Harrison's study and opened his pad. He drew for a long time. He drew the table first, the long flat line of it, the 2 settings at either end, the empty chairs arranged between them like an argument neither side had made yet. He drew Harrison as he had seen him at dinner, upright, contained, positioned in his chair as though waiting for something he had decided he was too proud to name. He drew the room not as it looked in terms of furniture and proportion, but as it felt, the weight of its silences, the way the space between the 2 men at that table was not simply distance, but something with texture and history, something that had been maintained so long it had started to look deliberate. Theo drew what he saw, and he drew what he understood, and the 2 things were, for him, never very far apart. When he was finished, he looked at it for a moment, then he slid it under the door of the study and walked back down the corridor to bed. By morning, The staff had passed along a quiet note to Clara. Mr. Whitmore had asked not to be disturbed before 9. This was unusual enough that the housekeeper mentioned it twice, in the tone people use when they can't explain something and are hoping someone else can. In his study, Harrison sat at his desk with the drawing in front of him. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the tea Margaret had left went cold without him noticing. Then he opened the deep bottom drawer of his desk and placed the drawing inside it, carefully, without folding it. He placed it beside something already resting there, the framed photograph, the one that lived face down on his desk, the one no one asked about, and the one Lily had looked at longest, and the one Harrison's hands never moved toward in company. He left it face down now as well, but his eyes travelled to it, the way your eyes find a thing in a room that you have told yourself you are not thinking about. His hands went flat on the desk. The silence in the study was the particular kind that follows something that cannot be unfelt. A child who had never set out to make a point about two men sitting at opposite ends of a table had made the only point that mattered. Not with an argument, not with a document, or a demand, or a legal position carefully prepared at a kitchen table at midnight, with a pencil and a piece of paper and the devastating accuracy of someone who sees things as they actually are. The photograph remained face down, but Harrison didn't look away from it for a very long time. Theo just said more with a pencil than most people manage in a lifetime of conversations. And we haven't even arrived at the moment that breaks this story wide open. If you are feeling this right now, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach the people who need stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because part 2 is coming, and you absolutely do not want to walk into that without knowing what happens tonight. Stay with me. The third night at Whitmore Manor was quieter than the first 2. Lily had been negotiated into bed with the promise that she could inspect the portrait gallery properly in the morning. Properly, being her word, delivered with the gravity of a professional commitment. Rose had been asleep before the lamp was off, curled on her side with one hand open on the pillow, the way she always slept, as though even in rest she was waiting to receive something. And Theo had his drawing pad beside him, and his eyes already closing by the time Clara pulled the door to. She couldn't sleep. She hadn't expected to. She found the narrow window at the end of the guest corridor, the one that looked out over the east garden, which was the one part of the Whitmore estate that had always felt slightly beyond the manor's control. The rest of the grounds were maintained with the precision of a public argument for wealth and order. But the east garden had always been looser, wilder at the edges, the kind of space that kept its own counsel. Clara remembered it from before. She hadn't let herself think about what else she remembered from before, so she stood at that window with her tea, and she looked at the garden, and she tried to keep herself inside the present tense. She heard him before she saw him. Not a loud sound, just the particular weight of a footstep she had apparently not forgotten how to recognize. She didn't turn immediately. She gave herself a breath. He came around the corner in a plain dark shirt, no jacket, no performance of himself. The chain was outside his collar tonight. Visible. She had noticed it on the first day, and refused to let her eyes finish the thought. Tonight it was there again, and at the end of it, she saw the shape of it, the unmistakable outline, and she looked at the window instead. "I didn't know you were still up," he said. "I couldn't sleep she said. They stood in the mutual acknowledgement of that for a moment. Two people at either end of a corridor that had no particular reason to hold them both, except that it did. The manor was large enough that this didn't have to keep happening. They both understood that it kept happening anyway. There is a particular quality to the silence that sits just before someone decides to say something true. Has a different texture than ordinary quiet. Clara had always been able to feel it, and she felt it now. And she wrapped both hands around her mug and waited. "Can I tell you something?" he said. She looked at him directly, and she said, "You can tell me anything you want. Whether it changes anything is a different conversation." The narrator wants to pause here, because that answer deserves to be understood. It was not coldness. It was not cruelty dressed up as composure. It was the measured, carefully built response of a woman who had been hurt with precision, who had received official documents and a silence that lasted 6 years, and a situation that required her to reconstruct herself entirely, and who had learned, in the process of that reconstruction, to be equally precise. She was not closing the door before he spoke. She was telling him, clearly, that she had stopped leaving doors open on faith alone. That was not the same thing. He nodded. He had expected it, or something like it. He said, "The morning 2 weeks after we were married, my father called. He didn't rush it. She didn't ask him to. He told her about the call, about the thing Harrison had held in each hand like a set of scales. On one side, her mother's treatment, the specialist, the facility, the cost that Clara could not have reached on her own income in a decade. On the other side, the marriage made public, acknowledged, folded into the Whitmore name, and everything that came with it. Harrison had given him 24 hours. He had framed it the way he framed every ultimatum, not as a threat, but as a clarification of available realities. "I told myself it was temporary," he said, "that I would find another way, that I would fix it quietly and come back to you before you had time to understand what I'd done." He said it plainly, and each self-deception landed as he named it, and it cost him something visible. You could see it in the way he held himself, the slight forward press of a man who has decided to stay in the room with what he's saying, even though every other instinct is suggesting the door. "I told myself you'd be safer not knowing, that I was protecting you, that a few weeks wouldn't become 6 years. He stopped. Then his hand went to the chain. He lifted it over his head, slowly, and held it out between them. The ring at the end of it, catching the dim corridor light the way Clara remembered it catching the light the first time she had seen it, in a different life, in a room that didn't exist in the same form anymore. "I never took it off," he said. What happened to Clara in that moment was not something her face fully communicated, because she had promised herself it wouldn't. The promise held. She didn't cry. But the thing that moved through her interior, the shift, the seismic and private rearrangement of something she had spent 6 years building into a fixed wall, that was real, and it was enormous, and anyone paying close enough attention might have seen it in the single second before her expression settled. She had not come back for this. She had come back for her children's rights, and a legal position carefully prepared at a kitchen table. She had not come back to stand in a corridor at midnight and feel the architecture of her certainty move under her feet. She turned. She walked to her door. She opened it and stepped through and closed it behind her, softly, with the quiet deliberateness of someone choosing not to slam it, choosing to close it, like a full stop, rather than an exclamation point. On the other side of the door, Ethan stood in the corridor. The ring was still in his hand. The house was completely still around him, and he listened to the quality of that stillness for a long time, the way a person listens to something they caused and cannot take back and would not, even now, entirely undo. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, without moving. Not frozen. She had not frozen. She was simply allowing herself to be still in a room with what she now knew, the way you put something heavy down on a table and stand back from it before you decide what to do next. Her hands were in her lap. The lamp was on. Outside, the east garden held whatever darkness a garden holds at that hour, and she did not look at it. She thought about the story. Every person who survives something difficult builds a story around it, not because they are weak or dishonest, but because the human mind requires a structure it can live inside. Clara's structure had been clean and load-bearing and entirely functional for 6 years. It went like this. He had a choice, and he chose money. He chose the Whitmore name and his father's approval, and the life he had always had over the life they had briefly, privately built together. She had been a chapter he'd decided not to continue. That was the story. She knew where to put the anger inside it. She knew where to draw the strength. She had pulled 3 children through 6 years on the scaffolding of that story, through the counting of grocery costs and the calculating of school fees and the particular 3 a.m. arithmetic of a woman who refuses to let the numbers beat her, through the years of building something small and warm and entirely her own, a life that no one had given her, that she had assembled piece by piece with the focused determination of someone who has decided that the thing that was taken from her will not also take what remains. The story had made all of that possible. The anger had been fuel of the cleanest kind, renewable, consistent, morally justified. Now, the story was wrong. She sat with that for a full minute before she allowed herself the qualification. Because the qualification mattered, and she was not going to let the corridor confession erase 6 years of real and documented harm with a single act of convenient revision. He had gone silent. He had let her receive those documents and draw the only conclusion available and leave the country with what she was carrying, alone, without a word. He had told himself it was temporary, and then watched temporary become a year, and then another, until temporary had acquired a different name entirely. That harm was real. It had happened inside her body, and her bank account, and her sleep, and her children's first years without a father. She was not going to set it aside, because he had finally said the true thing out loud. But the foundation, the part of the story she had needed most, the part where he simply hadn't loved her enough to stay, that part had never been true. And she had built 6 years of forward motion on the assumption that it was. There is a specific kind of grief that arrives when you lose the anger you needed to stay upright. It is not the grief of losing something you wanted to lose. It is the grief of a structural change, the feeling of a wall that was also a support beam coming down, and the sudden awareness of what it had been holding up. Clara felt it now, moving through her in the particular way of things that cannot be unfelt. And she let it move, because she had learned that resisting that kind of thing only extended its residency. What it left behind was not weakness. She was clear on that. It was grief, which is a different category entirely. Grief for the 2 years they'd had before the phone call. Grief for the morning she had stood in a flat that suddenly felt wrong and read documents that explained the wrongness with a cold and bureaucratic efficiency. Grief for the years her mother had spent in treatment that Clara had clawed money toward from every available direction, not knowing until tonight that the original cost had been paid in a currency she hadn't consented to spend. Grief for every night she had powered through at that kitchen table, keeping her face arranged so the children wouldn't see the fear underneath it. She looked through the open door at the 3 of them. Lily was on her back with one arm flung wide, occupying her half of the bed with the territorial confidence she brought to everything. Rose was, as she always was, curled, quiet, one hand open on the pillow. And Theo was still, his drawing pad on the nightstand, his face in sleep carrying the same quality of careful attention it carried when he was awake. She thought about a 28-year-old man standing somewhere in this house 6 years ago with a telephone call he hadn't been prepared for, and 24 hours to produce an answer to a question that had no good options inside it. She did not excuse it. She examined it. Those are not the same thing. She did not forgive him yet. She wanted the audience to understand that clearly, because this moment was not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a door you walk through when you are ready, and she was not ready, and she was not going to perform readiness she hadn't earned yet. What this moment was, what it actually was understanding. And understanding, when you have carried something heavy and sharp for 6 years, is its own seismic event. Does not feel like relief. Immediately. It feels like the absence of a weight you had stopped noticing you were holding, and the strange new ache in the muscles that had been compensating for it. She sat with all of it, until the sky outside the narrow window began to suggest morning in the tentative way it does, not announcing itself, just becoming incrementally less dark. Then she stood. She straightened her back. She looked at the room she was in, the guest room of a house where she had once worked and then briefly belonged and then been made to leave. And she found, somewhere in the honest wreckage of the night, a reason to stand that was not constructed from anger. It was constructed from truth, which was harder to carry and more durable by a significant margin. She was not done yet. Not with this house. Not with the conversation she still needed to have with Harrison Whitmore. Not with the legal position she had prepared for exactly this purpose. And not, though she did not examine that one too closely in the early morning light, not with the man who had stood in a corridor holding a ring he had never taken off. She was not done, and she was standing on something real. Rose woke the way she always woke. Not gradually, not with the slow surfacing of a child fighting consciousness, but all at once, with the immediate awareness that something nearby needed attending to. She had been this way since she was an infant. Clara had noticed it early. The quality of attention Rose brought to the world, even before she could name what she was attending to. She simply felt the direction of something, and moved toward it. In her family, this was how she operated. She didn't ask whether her mother was all right, because asking meant being told, yes, everything is fine, in the voice that meant the opposite. Instead, she climbed into Clara's lap without announcement, without explanation, and stayed there until whatever it was had been sat with properly. It worked. Clara had never been able to explain why. But it always worked. This morning, The thing that needed attending to was outside. She pulled on her cardigan and followed the noticing through the manor's corridors, past the portrait gallery where Lily would spend the morning, past the study with its closed door, through the heavy door at the back that led onto the grounds. The damp grass met her shoes immediately. The east garden in early morning had a particular quality of stillness, the kind that feels occupied rather than empty, as though the space itself is doing something private. Harrison was already there. He was standing near the far edge, where the rose bushes grew against the old iron fence, the overgrown section that the groundskeepers trimmed back each season, and which returned each spring with complete indifference to having been trimmed. He had his coat on, his hands in his pockets, and he was not pacing. He was not reviewing anything mentally or composing anything, or performing the activity of a man with somewhere to be. He was simply standing there, in the early morning, in the garden, present in the way a person is present when they have momentarily stopped managing themselves. Rose walked across the wet grass and stood beside him. She didn't ask if she could. She assessed the space next to him, determined it was available, and occupied it. She looked at the roses, the wild growth of them, the canes threading through the fence bars, the blooms that arrived every year regardless of what anyone did to discourage them. "The flowers are messy," she said. "Yes," Harrison said. She considered them for a moment. "Mama says sometimes the best things are messy, because they're growing." Harrison said nothing to that, but he looked at the particular rose that had wound itself through the iron gate, the one that came back every year, that resisted every intervention, that had decided it was going where it was going, and no amount of cutting back would renegotiate that. And something in his face shifted by a degree that most people would have missed. Rose did not miss it. She reached out and took his hand. Not his full hand. She was 6, and her reach had limits. But she wrapped both of her small hands around 2 of his fingers, matter of fact, without announcement, without looking up at him first. The way she did it suggested she had simply identified the thing that was needed and provided it, as naturally as passing someone a glass of water. Harrison looked down at her hands, on his fingers. He looked for a long time. "You have sad eyes, Grandpa," she said. She did not say it gently, exactly, and she did not say it critically. She said it the way children say true things before they have been taught to consider whether the truth is convenient for the person receiving it. It was an observation, delivered with the same uncomplicated directness she had brought to the window seat on the first day, the same quality that made people around her go slightly still. Harrison could not speak. The garden held them in its early quiet. Somewhere above the fence line, a bird made a brief and practical sound, and then stopped. The roses moved slightly in air that was barely wind. "Do you have someone to cry with, Grandpa?" Rose asked. The question was not rhetorical. She wanted to know. She had identified a deficit, and was inquiring about it with the earnest practicality of someone who believed all deficits had solutions if you were willing to look for them. Harrison looked at the roses, the fence, at the place where something kept growing back, despite every effort to keep it contained. "No," he said, quietly. "I don't suppose I do." Rose nodded, as though this confirmed what she had suspected. "We could be those people," she said, "if you want." And then Harrison Whitmore, who had built a fortune on the studied management of every room he occupied, did something that required no strategy and no authority and no 40 years of accumulated leverage. Slowly, by degrees that were barely measurable, his hand adjusted, not pulling back, turning, so that instead of her holding his fingers, he was holding hers. Just barely, just enough. The garden did not mark it with anything dramatic. The roses continued their indifferent growing. The bird did not return, but something that had been fixed in Harrison Whitmore for a very long time had moved, by the first measurable amount, in a different direction. The narrator will not oversell this. Was a millimeter, but a millimeter in the right place, in the right material, is how everything eventually gives. So here is where we are, at the end of this first part of the story, and I need you to understand how much is still in motion. Clara has heard the truth. Not the truth she built 6 years of survival on, but the real one, the harder one, the one that doesn't give her anger back, and instead leaves her standing on something more durable and considerably more complicated. Harrison has been touched, literally, by a child who didn't ask permission and found the precise thing he had been without for longer than he would ever say out loud. Theo's drawing is in the bottom drawer of Harrison's desk, beside a photograph that no one in this house has looked at properly in years. And Rose is in the garden, holding the hand of a man who has spent the better part of his life making sure no one got close enough to notice his eyes. But here is what is also true tonight. The person who built the wall that brought all of these people to this position is sitting in her room with a document half written on her desk. Believes she has until morning to finish it. She believes Harrison's hesitation is what it has always been. Temporary, manageable, a pause before the return to structure. She does not know that Ethan knows where the original marriage certificate is. She does not know that the ground she has been standing on for 6 years is already in the process of renegotiating itself beneath her carefully organized files. And Harrison, who walked back inside from the garden, who went to his study, who sat at his desk with Theo's drawing in the drawer beneath his hands, did something tonight that he has not done in a very long time. He reached for the framed photograph, the one that lives face down, the one Lily looked at longest, and Rose's question came closest to, and which Harrison's hands have never moved toward in company. Tonight alone, he turned it over. He looked at it properly, in the light, for the first time in years. The narrator will not tell you yet who is in it, only this. After he looked at it, he did not put it back face down. He left it as it was. Clara, who did not forgive him, who said so plainly and meant it, who sat through a night that belongs entirely to her and came out the other side standing on truth instead of anger. Clara will walk into whatever the morning brings. The question is not whether she is strong enough for what's coming. We have established, thoroughly and without any remaining doubt, that she is. The question is whether the truth about that marriage certificate surfaces before the woman with the notepad finishes what she is writing tonight. Part 2 is coming, and when the documents surface, when the original marriage certificate walks into the same room as the forgery, nothing in Whitmore Manor will be the same. Someone built a life on a lie, and the truth has 3 6-year-old reasons to finish what it started. Thank you for staying all the way to the end of this one. Genuinely, this story asked something of you. It asked you to sit with people in their complicated, damaged, still reaching humanity. And you stayed. That matters to this channel more than any number I can look at on a screen. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Which of the three children do you see yourself in? Are you Lily, the one who walks through every closed door without hesitation, who conducts her inspection and delivers her findings without apology? Are you Rose, the one who reaches for people, who identifies the deficit and simply fills it, without fanfare, without needing to be asked? Or are you Theo, the one who sees everything, holds it quietly, and says it only when it matters most, and usually in a way that no one forgets? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I already have a feeling about which one this audience is. And while you're down there, tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. This community stretches further than you know, and there is something I find genuinely moving about that. If this story landed for you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs it, not for the algorithm, for the person in your life who has been carrying something heavy and might need to see a story about people who find their way back through the most unlikely doors. Subscribe if you haven't yet, so Part 2 finds you the moment it arrives. Because Part 2 is where the secrets stop being secrets, and Margaret Ellis is about to find out what happens when the woman you underestimated keeps every receipt. I'll see you there, and remember to always keep it golden. Thank you for being here.